really humbled and honored to be moderating what is going to be a most powerful session with some very powerful leaders in education. I am a high school principal, but we have with us some leaders in the post-secondary realm to discuss the impact of George Floyd and recent social unrest and the impact that it has had on their leadership and moving forward in their institutions. We're going to try to get to their what they want to offer as quickly as possible. And so my first question to you panelists, and before you answer the question, I ask that you just give a brief introduction of who you are, is in light of George Floyd and recent social unrest, personally, what impact did that have on your leadership? Did it change your leadership? Did it embolden your leadership? What challenges did it present for your leadership? Just what impact did it have on you personally? And Dr. Aisha Francis, we will start with you.
Good morning, all, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I think I am a college president of Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology, which is a minority serving institution, tech and trade in the Boston area. And we happen to have a distinction of being a student population that is mostly Black and Latino, so mostly Black and Latin young men, right? And so for me, as someone who's a student of African-American history, thinking about this horrible incident of a live murder essentially was so disturbing, but also we've been here before. And I think what my approach to seeing this horror unfold, it was to think about the safety of the students and their ability to process what was happening. And so my team and I really spent a lot of time thinking about the ways in which we could undergird the wellness and mental health services and counseling services that we already have on offer. And so that was my first thought and the priority of my leadership approach to how to handle the George Floyd murder and the aftermath in terms of supporting the students that we have.
Sure, it is sort of pointed that you talk about just safety and how we have not been here before. But I think all of this caused us to sort of rethink our leadership. Dr. Pelton, would you like to weigh in? You're on mute, Dr. Pelton. You're on mute.
Lee Pelton, I am now president and CEO of the Boston Foundation, which is one of the nation's largest and oldest community foundations. And previous to that, I was president of Emerson College for 10 years and have been a college president until I took on this new role for 23 years. Well, I took George Floyd's murder very personally, and I wrote a letter, an essay to my community that begins by saying that today I write to you as a Black man and as the president of Emerson College. There is no other way to write to you given these events. That letter set to make clear and make visible the invisible, which is that I am George Floyd too. We are George Floyd too. This is the lived experience. As Aisha just said, this is not new. We have been here before. And that letter was seen by 7 to 8 million people around the globe. So it had I think, a pretty powerful impact, not only in Boston, but well beyond that. And so for me, this was an opportunity. Every challenge produces an opportunity. This was an opportunity to step out of my presidential role and make clear my Blackness, yes, and the impact that has had on me, and for millions of other people just like me. So I could talk about what we're doing at, how this impacted the current job that I'm doing, but why don't I just stop there and give somebody else some time?
Sure, sure. It's interesting that your comment, it caused you to step out of your professional role and write the letter in the context of just being a Black man. That was an interesting point. Dr. Orozco?
Good morning, and thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation. To me, the cold murder of Mr. Floyd in such a necrophilic, in such an exhibitionistic way, telecasted the deep, deep, deep wounds that flow from the kinetic momentum the invasion of racialized inequality is having in every domain of economy and society. When I arrived as chancellor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, the only public urban research university in Boston, most diverse university in New England, third most diverse campus in the United States. This had a deep, deep impact in my core. And it was the necrophilic and the exhibitionistic murder of this human being, but also the moving words of one of the pastors at the service who called us to act in ways that are meaningful, that are pragmatic. I'm a pragmatist. And I, at that moment, funded, as the incoming chancellor, with my own resources, a $50,000 scholarship for our most underserved students in honor of the memory of Mr. Floyd. And I'm so happy to say that this created an avalanche of goodwill from citizens, our brothers and sisters from throughout the country. We received donations from all over that more than tripled my original gesture. So to me, my marching orders became, as I arrived at UMass Boston, how do we develop the vehicles to meaningfully build a research university in an urban setting that is anti-race and is health promoting? Racism is a health epidemic in this country. We talk about COVID, the catastrophic dynamics of the 21st century, the pandemics, unchecked climate change, the invasion of racialized inequality are affecting our communities. And I speak as a immigrant, English language learner, community college transfer student, first generation to college, individual. It is our communities that are paying the greatest penalties for domains where they have the least input. The pandemic is exhibit A, climate change, and of course, above all, racialized inequality. So our work continues. This is a legacy of over 400 years. Our work continues. And today, in an urban public research university, if we are not doing the work of anti-racism, we're not doing our work.
Very powerful, doctor. Very powerful. Particularly when you speak of how it affects the least of ours, and how the way we educate and continue to educate will affect lives in a plethora of genres. Dr. Irving, would you like to weigh in?
Morning, and thank you, everybody, and also for having me here and lending an ear. MERRILL Irving, I'm president of Hennepin Technical College. This is my 7th year as president. For those people who ask, well, where's Hennepin? Well, we have two campuses on the western corridor of Minneapolis, one in Brooklyn Park and one in Eden Prairie, and the county seat for Hennepin is Minneapolis. We were a direct effect with our students not being able to be bused to campuses with buildings that had spray paint on them that says, please don't burn here because my children are living on the 7th floor. My college is 62% of underrepresented populations, and we're the largest technical college in the state of Minnesota. 30% of the people who work in law enforcement in the state of Minnesota actively right now have graduated from our college, those whom you may have seen on TV. So it's a very perplexing place to be and be who I am in leadership. I will also state I've born and raised in West Virginia. My grandfather was a civil rights leader, but he was also a cop. I've worked in higher ed and done good work, Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, now Minneapolis. What I'll say is, as a leader, is that I've learned very quickly is that we are still talking about equality. We're talking about equity, but we're not talking about how we will liberate populations who've been left behind, those that have been recipients of genocide. And what does that mean? Well, it means at my college, we started a campaign and we're going to end the white silence. We have to find a way to not just empower other Black and brown voices, is that we have to empower, as we saw on TV, that the real change happened when white voices spoke up and took to the streets. Not one law in this United States has been amended or ratified or changed without a white voice. Not one Global Globe or Oscar has been awarded without a white voice. And not one major stock exchange on Wall Street has not been conducted without a white voice. The truth of the matter is that we spent so much time talking about police brutality, but we're very afraid to talk about race. We won't talk about it in our school systems because we're scared that it's going to offend other people's children, although other marginalized populations experience those type of undeserving behaviors all the time and are shortchanged. We're afraid to talk about that in higher education because some of our lawmakers and many of the other ones are saying, what does it mean that you're saying we live in a white construct? Well, we do. We live in the same white construct that exists all across the United States. And some people would say, well, I'm sorry you're from Mississippi. I'm sorry you're from Alabama. But the truth of the matter is racism is around this entire United States. And for me as a leader, I learned that I'm tired of making people comfortable. My outspokenness, and I think as leaders, particularly as Black leaders, we've found a way that we think to be successful is that we have to make most white folks feel comfortable to have the conversation. I think the true part is being reflective, to allow people knowing that what their power and their position is within change, within the construct that we exist in, can really make the long systemic change when we talk about the construct of whiteness. And so that has been one of the bigger pieces of me. I'm tired of talking about equality and I'm tired of talking about equity. I think we need to have a conversation on liberation and we need to be unafraid to talk about the power of whiteness.
Yep. So let's talk about liberating. You know, we're kind of living in the midst of two serious things that impact education. One, we have what we just discussed, George Floyd and the impact, but now we have the impact of a pandemic. And at the secondary level, it is pretty profound when we deal with the loss of learning that has occurred, particularly with our underserved population. My next question to you all as the leaders of your institutions, how do you foresee managing and liberating Black and brown folk so that they can have the type of education that is in fact liberating, all while in the context of them coming to you academically being even further behind than they already have presented themselves to you? I'll leave the floor open to anybody who wants to jump in.
So, I mean, that is a important question for this moment. And one of the ways that I think is important to respond to that is by bringing education and opportunity to where people are, bringing it even closer, making sure that our institutions are as student ready as possible. For too long, we put the onus on learners, you know, to be college ready, or, you know, we've approached educational attainment from a deficit mindset. And I think even more so right now, our focus needs to be on how we need to change our culture. I mean, I love much of what you said, Dr. Irvin. You know, how do we change what it is that we do to make ourselves more accessible, to present fewer hurdles, to offer education in more bite-sized pieces so that people can take up the opportunities that are presented to them. And so what that means literally for our college is a march to be even closer to many of the populations we serve. So to move from the South End to Roxbury, which is what we are looking forward to doing in a few years. And even before that, to figure out ways to be present and embedded in the Roxbury community even now, so that people can understand through proximity that education, higher education, post-secondary education is attainable, accessible, and affordable, and to demystify the ways in which they might be perceiving, any learning loss or insecurities they have as barriers to moving forward with their learning in a way that would get them closer to the jobs that they need to move into the middle class. So I think proximity is important. And I think really reframing accessibility and affordability with these, in community conversations is critical right now.
Absolutely. I think it's huge that we continue to connect and sort of bring our story to where it needs to be heard and create that bridge, as you mentioned, Dr. Francis, to be accessible, attainable, and affordable. That is huge for us. Anybody else would like to jump in?
Yeah, I think I would, because, Emerson, again, I'm not president of a college anymore, but Emerson is a residential college. And so almost all of our students live on campus. So it's a community in that sense that might be different, say, from a community college, because we have a different kind of mission. And so I think that those of us who are in residential colleges have some real serious work to do within ourselves, first and foremost. James Baldwin put it to us the right way when he said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so all of this begins with what I call repair work, which is getting down and having the courage to have an honest appraisal of what created the inequities we face today, not only in education, but health and wealth and business and so on, but also in our own communities and our own college communities. And we need to, I think, begin, the work there. And at Emerson, I felt that this is not work that we could do ourselves, that we had to actually bring in a third party to help us understand, interrogate, as they say, all of the barriers within our own community that prevented our brown and Black and Asian folks from succeeding in our community. Because so many of these students have a sense of not belonging. Many of these students face barriers every day in our residential colleges, not only in the classroom, but the encounters that they have with other students, the encounters that they may have, in various offices. And so we have to, I think for us, we have to begin there. And I will say point blank, I don't believe that enough colleges and universities, residential colleges and universities, have begun that hard work of excavating the barriers to success in our own environments.
Outstanding, Dr. Pelton. And I'm going to come to you, Dr. OROZCO, because I think, particularly in the context of Black and brown folk, we are always sort of fighting these barriers. there are always barriers to exist. And when we alleviate one barrier, it seems like another barrier comes. My question to you is, what are some very significant barriers that you see that we need to face, and how can we address those in the context of our educational system?
Yeah, beautiful. So important. And I want to congratulate my colleague, Lee PELTON, for his call to the endeavor of creating a culture of repairing the assaults to the social fabric, to the human heart, to human potential. I think COVID-19 for our communities represented an educational catastrophe in every domain. You look at where we started, you look at who's going to get infected, you look at who's going to get hospitalized, you look at mortality rates, you look at the rates that flow from all the so-called mood disorders, stress, anxiety, depression, suicidality, suicide. You look at the lost learning, talk about the repair work that needs to be done in that domain. That gives you the X-ray of the structures and the strictures of inequality and the barriers that are threatening with this enormous undertow to drown so many of our youngsters in our communities at a time when we are facing a demographic transition. And this is unfolding in the streets of Boston, but also it's unfolding in Minnesota. It's unfolding throughout California. It's unfolding in New York City. These are cities I know very, very well. I've spent time working and doing research. The only sector of the population growing now are the children of color, the children of immigrants. You look at the data for Boston, for the Commonwealth. Asians are now the fastest growing sector of the child population at a time when hate crime against our brothers and sisters in the Asian communities is skyrocketing in our country. So in order to get in front of the catastrophe that has been COVID, just the loss of learning itself is catastrophic. We've gone back, we've regressed as a society. The minor advances, when we look at the data comparatively, have been lost in the context of COVID. So the barriers are multiple. The barriers are systemic. The barriers start in the heart, but they also flow to the institutions, to the structures and the strictures that pattern, shape opportunity, shape mobility, shape the pathway to our richer life, to our life that is more meaningful, to a life of flourishing. And I quote my esteemed colleague, the former president and the new president of our iconic foundation here in Boston. If we don't face the realities, we can't get in front of them. We have a crisis of perception in our country. You can't solve things that you can't face. That's the work in higher education. If we're not doing the work of anti-racism, of dismantling the oppressive structures of inequality, the invasion of inequality is threatening the practice of democratic citizenship in our country. This is numero uno. I mean, climate change is right there with it, and climate change is affecting our communities. You look at the data on what climate change is doing, this is catastrophic. The top billion people on earth, this is the Europe and the US, are polluting everything. The bottom 3 billion people in Africa, people in Latin America, people in Asia, are paying the consequences. The data, you look at the algorithm internally for our country, the same outcomes, identical. It's our communities of color that pay the greatest penalty. I was a dean at UCLA for a decade. I can take you to the neighborhoods that are most affected by unchecked climate change, and you're not going to be surprised. These are the neighborhoods where our Latinx, our African American, our Black brothers and sisters live. That's the reality of the world we are today. We need to get in front, and we need to start. We need to start where my colleague, President PELTON, suggested, quoting the great Baldwin. We need to start by facing the facts. We live in a society today where facts, science, there's a new word out there that didn't exist. Post-truth. According to the Oxford English dictionaries, this was the word of the year for them. Because now all of a sudden, it's not the facts, it's whatever you want the facts to be. It's whatever your mood tells you. It's driven by emotion. We can't fix any of the issues we have if we continue to swim in this world of post-truth. We can't. This is a huge risk in our society today.
Dr. OROZCO, you mentioned something that was particularly inspirational. And Dr. Irvin, I'm coming to you. When you talked about getting in front, Dr. OROZCO, and you mentioned some systemic things that really affect Black and brown folk. From a high school standpoint, when we look at a data point of graduation rate, and for those kids who do not graduate, how it affects their lives academically, poverty-wise, healthcare-wise, job-wise, it is just from that particular data point, it becomes systemic. And so, Dr. Irvin, I want to come to you to get you, because you talked about liberating, having an education that is liberating. And to me, it's almost synonymous to say we are in front of and we are liberating our folks. So what do you see as a major challenge sort of at the post-secondary level about having an education that is in front of and that is liberating for Black and brown folk?
Well, first I'll start off with the unfortunate fact is that we have more Black and brown folks with college degrees, but the real fact is they're making less money than their white counterpart who has a high school diploma. That's one unfun fact. The other thing is that we learned at my college that we needed to stop using the term people of color. It's a grouping of a bunch of people who are not white, and it becomes a convenience and not a benefactor. When you look at the data points are showing specific people who are not benefiting, and we had to disaggregate our data to show who's really not benefiting. And you know who it was across the board was Black men over the age of 26. We found out we had 170 different type of holds at my college. You didn't turn your book in on time. You still have your laptop too late. This was holding, so policies and procedures that are holding a group of people back, which the average age of our students is 27 and they're working adults. And so if the Black men at the age of 26, it was a huge data point that we were seeing. Also complaints that were filed. Number one group that were filed, over 90% of them were against Black men over the age of 26. We had an issue. So policies, procedures, and then curriculum change. We hired a social worker to come in to help look at empathy, how we're redesigning empathy and how are we redesigning our curriculum to make sure that we're empowering not only our Black students, but making our faculty aware of what we need to do to make the long-term change. And that comes in strategic planning. I think that one of the bigger things that we always hear is that people forget why we do this work. They're like, I don't understand why we're still talking about this. Slavery existed over 200 some years ago, but they forget about the fact that we were denying the rights of people well beyond the civil rights movement, that we were denying the right to property, to home loans, that, this is a bigger issue that people seem to forget why we are where we are and why it's not changing. And it is bigger than education, but it does start with, if we're going to talk about K through 12, why are we uncomfortable talking about race? We'll talk about slavery, but we won't talk about race. Why? I just think there's some things that needs to be answered before we're ready to move forward.
Certainly. Dr. Francis, I want to come to you. One of the things that Dr. Irvin mentioned what was his faculty. And so the conversation today has been largely around students that come into the post-secondary realm. I'm interested in the impact that you have or what you see as a barrier in terms of your faculty that is delivering instruction to your students. Is there an issue with your faculty, and how do you sort of the issues that you presented and the barriers that you talked about earlier, particularly around mental health and safety, how do you impart that to your faculty to then impart that to your students?
Absolutely. That's a very important question. And as a former faculty member, I think one of the most important things that we can do on our campuses is really invest in professional development in bite-sized pieces on a regular basis, not a one-off workshop, but and change culture that way. And I think that is where we are at Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology. We really are beginning the process of investing more in faculty development and professional development, and some of the making sure that they are prepared with the tools of cultural humility. And that they have a forum where they can have their questions answered, because what we ask of people in the midst of the classroom is really quite daunting if people haven't ever taught before. For you to stand in front of or beside, however you set up your classroom, it is quite a powerful experience, but it's also quite a daunting experience. And when your focus is really only on your material, right? But your students are bringing with them their lived experiences, their lives, the bills that are late, and a person in their family who's sick, and the job that they've got to get to with only 30 minutes, in between classes. Those are the things that we owe it to our faculty to help them understand how to allow space and grace for that in their classroom and still impart material. So, I think that training and professional development, again, on a regular basis in dialogue with our faculty is really critical, and it's important. And it has been overlooked in many cases, particularly at underfunded, or in our case, we're a private institution, so we don't have, state funding, but at institutions that are resource constrained. And that is where the majority of people of color are getting educated, at public institutions, minority serving institutions, the community colleges, and those tend to be places that are underfunded. And I do think we need to think about where we're placing our faculty resources and training.
Absolutely. I'll pose this question to the board. How do we reconcile that culturally responsive teaching in a way that is it is systemic over time, as opposed to it always coming up when something happens in the community, and now culturally responsive teaching becomes almost something that is just powerful today, but at some point it kind of diminishes. How do you impart that to your faculty so it's a part of your system and not a response to something that happens culturally?
First of all, let me jump in. I don't think it's just faculty that we're talking about, which is what I was trying to say earlier. We're talking about the entire institution. It also includes students, includes staff and faculty on a residential college. So I think that's the place that we can begin. This country, our nation, has always been in what Neil Painter, a great Princeton historian, called a call and response. Something happens, and then there is a response to it.
Yes.
And then, but America has a deep amnesia problem. And as Reverend Barber once said, there's a call and a response, and then America loses its mind. And so that is, that's the rhythm that we're in today, and have been for centuries.
Yes.
So it's our responsibility, wherever we are, whether in higher education with me, if we're in the philanthropic world, to do our very best to sustain and keep a focus on what really matters. Because if we don't, we're just gonna continue to see this tape play over and over again. So that would be a general statement that I would make, and I think each of us on this panel have a different way of approaching this issue and entering this issue and repairing, as I said earlier. But that's that's the pattern that we're in.
Dr. Irvin?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on, I think that intent and sustainability is only systemic due to culture. And so it is not, yes, just faculty, staff, and students, but there's also a greater culture. And I think that the greater culture, when it comes to talking about issues like this, but specifically when it comes to race, if it's my white male or white counterparts, that there's a declaration of innocence. Well, I'm not racist, because there's this assumption that racism is only direct actions against people, not the perpetuation of dominant voices against those who need a lift. And then the other part is that, even when it comes to some of my other Black counterparts, when George Floyd was murdered, some of them asked me, like, what made him special? They've been doing that to us for years. Why him? And it was shocking to me, but it was just as shocking to see as many as my white colleagues be completely silent and uncomfortable when we wanted to talk anything about this. People feel very comfortable talking about police brutality, but they didn't want to talk about the part when it came to race. And so I think the bigger piece for the cultural change is that everybody needs to understand that you have a responsibility. And it's not a black and brown. It is, if you are white as well, you have a responsibility, because it is a construct of whiteness. And I think that the cultural change will only be systemic due to everyone understanding their responsibility in the construct that we exist in.
Dr. OROZCO?
I concur with Dr. Irvin that the issue of silence is so present throughout our institutions. And ironically, so I was a dean for a decade of the UCLA's oldest and highest ranked school, and we did a survey of the faculty. And what we found this paradox. It's mostly a white faculty at a research university like UCLA, and race is either numero uno or numero dos. And as our colleague Dr. Irvin suggested, it's a lot of silence. It's a lot of like an approach avoidance, mostly avoidance, and a call to get training, to get support, to enter those conversations. Those are the two poles that we identified just through a systematic survey of the UCLA faculty. Approach avoidance, approach avoid, approach avoidance.
Yes.
Enormous amount of sort of one step forward, two step back. But as Dr. Irvin said, until those voices speak up, until we shatter the culture of silence, which is a culture of complicity, the progress is going to be, millimeter by millimeter. Not going to make the transformational progress we need now, given the crisis of inequality, given the planetary crisis, given the health crises. The system is not working. The algorithm doesn't work. We need to create new vehicles if we're to get in front of the threats of our times.
I'm going to ask a closing question. And we're all educators. You all are really at the top of the food chain in your positions. But there's always one thing that kind of keeps us up at night. And it doesn't necessarily have to be huge globally. I mean, we've had a really rich conversation. For me in my position, what keeps me up at night is how to improve the Lexile scores of our 9th graders so that they can enter into text and be able to manipulate text at their grade level. And so we have some students whose Lexile scores are at the 3rd and 4th grade level. That keeps me up at night as an educator, because when I look into their lives 5 or 10 years later, if we don't intervene in that now, it's just going to be not a good life for them. In closing, I'm interested, just as an educator, what keeps you up at night? Dr. Francis, we'll start with you.
Sure. It is very tangible for me how many people don't believe that a post-secondary education is available to them. And I think that there have to be different ways for us to reach folks, to let them know that it is and that it's essential. So I think, doing a better job of helping people really understand that this, that training in whatever it is they want to get training in is out there and it is for them. It is for them. That does keep me up at night.
Not only is it for them, Dr. Francis, but they deserve it.
That's right.
Dr. Pelton.
Well, for me, it's an input and an output question. The input question, and by the way, I call it my KPAN list, things that keep the president up at night. So I talk to my board about my KPAN list every time we meet. So the input is that keeps me up at night is being able to around access and affordability. We all know that, especially at places like Emerson, where the tuition total cost is approaching it's over $60,000 and approaching $70,000 in total. So making sure that talented folks, can access what we have and afford it when they get here. The output is making sure that they have an experience where, as I said earlier, there's a feeling of belonging and a place where they can truly thrive, and a place where we continue to chip away at these barriers that we've all been talking about, that prevent them from having the most successful, most fulfilling experiences that they can have. So those two things keep me up at night.
Absolutely. I'm going to come to Dr. Irvin, and then we'll close with you, Dr. OROZCO. Emerson, I feel like you're that music that comes on right at the end of we need a commercial break. So Dr. Irvin will come to you, and then Dr. OROZCO will come to you, and then we'll hand it to you, Emerson.
Even with the college, we're in our communities, no matter how many steps forward, we seem to take a ton of them back. Whether there's issues with voting rights for my students, depending on where they live and their access to be able to vote, whether it's generational wealth. And no matter how many degrees I'm able to attain for our students, and if they're Black or brown, they're still not making what their white counterpart with a high school diploma is making. This is disturbing to look in Black communities that existed and now freeways run through them, and that no one's concerned. That long-term, what does that do to communities? How do you uplift yourself when the control is outside of your radius? It keeps me up at night to know that I can do the best I can for my students. And at the end of the day, is it still good enough? And I think that we really have to be challenged to look beyond our institutions, our states, but this entire white construct that we're in and how powerful it really is.
Dr. OROZCO?
Speaking from the heart now, it's got to be student debt. 1.2 trillion. This is the second largest structured debt in the history of American capitalism. This is crushing the lives, the dreams, the ganas of our immigrant students, our first generation to college students, our rural students. This is unsustainable. This is a piece of an unsustainable humanity as Exhibit A. I testified before the legislature, and you hear in the voices of our students the pain that flows from being caught by the following paradox. Education is numero uno for so many of our students. That drive, that engagement is what's bankrupting so many of our students. This is a national crisis.
Emerson, I don't know if you're listening, but we had a powerful, powerful conversation, my brother. Powerful.
I was, and forgive me if my internet is spotty and I'm not coming in clear. I hope I am.
You're clear.
But this conversation was absolutely powerful, as I knew it would be. Know a couple of you fairly well and have interacted with you, so this is not surprising. Just incredibly, pointed messages and certainly things for us to really think about as we're thinking about educating our community and the role, I think, of just higher education overall and your leadership plays within our community. So great stuff. One question, as you think about just the higher education landscape in general, progression for your peers, individuals who are looking for professional positions and tenured positions, et cetera. Do you see that whole kind of paradigm getting better for your peers, for professionals of color within higher education since the murder of George Floyd? I'm sure some of these institutions of higher learning have made commitments around equity, et cetera. But are you seeing, individuals such as yourself rising in tenured roles and administrative roles in higher ed? And that's for the entire panel.
Well, I'll jump in. I will tell you, I have 4 unions, and when I sit at my table, I'm the only person that's not white. And that's in each one of the meetings. I think that there's a power construct that even my faculty who are from diverse populations have to exist in, even to get tenure. And even if they do come in, if there was something as called, last in, first out, so if there was layoffs, then that's what happens to you. Again, I go back to the constructs that we exist in. I think that it's exciting to see that we're having the right conversations, but I don't think the paradigm has really changed that much, and it won't that fast. It will not. I think that's part of the problem that we have in America, that we get really excited about having these conversations so quickly, and we walk away from them so quickly, but nothing's ever changed. And so, I think I'm blessed enough that this happened today on the screen and that we're able to encourage so many others that are like us, that are looking for this conversation. And I think this is, for me, probably the most systemic thing I'd like to see all over the place. And again, thank you guys for having us.
Any other thoughts on that?
I'll just follow up briefly, just to say that there has been, I think, a long-term assault on tenure, right? So that's something that's been happening for a very long time at the Academy. And I think that in terms of what our institutions look like, the look and feel of our institutions and their ability to really live out some of the vision that we've been really sharing as institutional leaders, it requires a long-term sense of planning, right? And also thinking about what things you can put in place that will outlive you, that will be there when you leave. Because that's another challenge that happens, is that the institutional leadership changes, and as it's wont to do, and then good initiatives die on the vine. So that's one of the ways that I've been approaching this work is, what can you embed in ways that, if I were not here, it would have a stronger chance of staying in place. It would be sticky. So I think that's just a different way of thinking about it. But I agree that the time has been short, but we have been able to make some changes in terms of, for instance, board composition. The board of Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology is majority minority now. It was not a year and a half ago. So I think that, and that's been intentional on the part of the governance committee. And so I think there are some ways that things have changed, but we've got to really keep the pressure on internally.
So Emerson, I would say this, that there's a view that the most effective antidote to inequitable societal policies and procedures is to change the balance of power, rather than to seek to change the minds of those in power. And so leadership, as you're suggesting, is very, very important. I've been involved in a project with the EOS Foundation, seeking to change the leadership of our, again, we're talking about presidents and provosts and deans mostly in the Commonwealth. And what we've seen is it's kind of a good start, and 2 steps forward and another step backwards. And so we have, we speaking from a holistic point of view, we're going to stay focused on challenging our institutions of higher learning in the Commonwealth to do better, not only around these positions, but also with respect to pay, because there's a huge, huge pay gap, what I call a power gap, for women and folks of color. I can tell you this, that when I became president, 23 years ago, I was one of 4, maybe 5 African-American presidents in the nation at 4-year private institutions, excluding historically Black colleges and universities, only 4 or 5. And that number has accelerated, particularly in the last decade or so. I think what underlies your question and the conversation is that the tendency to, that we're going to fix something so we can fix it and move on from it. But excellence is about continuous improvement. That's what excellence is about. And so these issues that we're dealing with are systemic, they're structural, and they're long-standing. I think we've heard Dr. Irving say earlier, they're going to require some time and some effort to get us to where we want to be. But it's always continuous.
Mhm.
If I
Last
may,
word, Dr. Orozco.
Emerson, thank you. I'll paraphrase Antonio Gramsci, who once said, "I'm pessimistic by intellect, but optimist by will." I, serve in a number of Latinx, Hispanic boards and commissions in higher education. And as President PELTON noted, there has been some kinetic movement, only very, very recently. But still, the numbers are shameful, given the kinetic rapidity of our demographic change. At the level of the presidents, at the level of the chancellors, the Latino, Hispanic, Latinx representation is entirely inadequate and entirely undemocratic. And this is an area where it has to be all hands on deck. 100 years of basic research in cognitive neuroscience will tell you one lesson, and that is kids identify with and learn relationally. They need to see themselves in some kind of a future. What education should be is, as Malaguzzi once said, a nostalgia for the future, meaning there's a future. We can't be nostalgic about the past. There's a lot of stuff that it's horrific in the past. A nostalgia for the future. How are we going to meet the children of today in that future? And again, my optimism flows from my human will, from the heart to rage and to take on the battle, not from what I'm seeing when I look at the numbers.
Thank you. Just powerful. And so thank you, Dr. Orozco. Dr. Irving, at some point I got to get to Brooklyn Park and visit your campus there, and Lee, for your ongoing work, certainly in the Boston
Minneapolis, not Portland.
Minneapolis, I'm sorry, Minneapolis. And obviously Dr. Francis, just a pleasure to have you with us, and great pearls of wisdom and just a terrific work going on at BFIT, and congratulations on a new campus as well. So, just a lot of great work that you all lead in. Thank you for your continued leadership in our community. And I think there's a lot that we can walk away from here to really put in motion to really bring about, better equity on these campuses. So thank you. Thank you, Rick. Always a pleasure, my man. Thank you for your support here and leading this panel discussion and your work with the Atlanta Men's Dinner Group down there. So thank you, Rick. So we are going to break for lunch. We'll be back at 12:30 with an incredible panel of financial and banking folks. When we mentioned the fact that $50 to $60 billion was committed in the aftermath of George Floyd, a good amount of that money was committed by financial services and banking firms. So, want to definitely hear what's happened within that industry and how we're carrying forward some of the change that they committed to. All right, so see you all again at 12:30. Thank you. Thank you, panel.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.